What if a civilization did everything right, survived for centuries at the edge of the known world, maintained religion, trade, law, and family life, and then disappeared without a single recorded moment of collapse? Not destroyed by conquest, not erased by plague, not undone by ignorance, but quietly extinguished while still functioning. The Viking settlements of Greenland did not vanish suddenly, and they did not fail because they were foolish or primitive. They vanished after nearly 500 years of continuous occupation, at a time when they still held weddings, issued certificates, maintained churches, and sent ships abroad. The last written record is not of panic or violence, but of a marriage. If history usually ends civilizations with noise and chaos, Greenland ends in silence, and silence, in archaeology, is rarely accidental. The most common assumption is that the Greenland Vikings were doomed from the moment they arrived, that the land was simply too cold, too barren, too hostile for European farmers to survive in any meaningful way. It is an assumption that feels intuitive, modern, and comforting, and it is almost entirely wrong. Archaeology tells a quieter but far more unsettling story. For generations, the Norse built stable farms, raised cattle, sheep, and goats, constructed churches of stone and turf, and sustained a social order that closely mirrored life in Iceland and coastal Norway. These were not desperate encampments clinging to survival, but functioning communities with law, religion, and continuity. They did not starve upon arrival, nor did they exist in a state of perpetual crisis. On the contrary, for more than 2 centuries, the settlements expanded, stabilized, and became deeply embedded in European trade networks that stretched across the North Atlantic. A colony that was doomed does not export luxury goods, train clergy, or maintain transoceanic shipping routes for hundreds of years. The true paradox of Greenland is not that the Vikings failed there. It is that they succeeded for so long in a place that should never have allowed it. It is deeply tempting to believe that successful societies endure because they are self-reliant, that survival comes from independence rather than connection. Greenland exposes the weakness of that belief. The Norse did not survive in Greenland despite their dependence on Europe. They survived precisely because of it. The land could not provide what their society structurally required. There was almost no timber for ships or buildings, no iron ore for tools or weapons, and no reliable grain harvest for bread. These were not optional comforts that made life easier. They were the invisible framework that made the colony possible at all. Ships demanded wood and iron, tools demanded metal, bread demanded imported grain. Without these, daily life did not merely become harder, it ceased to function. Trade, therefore, was not a supplement to life in Greenland. It was life itself. As long as ships continued to arrive from Norway, the system held together. When those ships stopped coming, the settlement did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it began to suffocate slowly, quietly, in ways that left almost no trace in written history, yet proved fatal all the same. Modern narratives often reduce the disappearance of the Greenland Vikings to a single cause, blaming climate change, as if colder temperatures simply froze the colony out of existence. This explanation feels clean, decisive, and incomplete. The Little Ice Age did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. It arrived as a narrowing of margins that had once allowed survival. Summers grew shorter, not apocalyptic. Shorter summers produced less hay. Less hay forced livestock indoors for longer winters. Longer winters meant more resources consumed without replacement. Nothing here collapsed dramatically. Nothing failed all at once. This was not a failure of courage or effort, it was a failure of arithmetic. A single degree of cooling was enough to convert balance into deficit. In a society already operating at the absolute edge of agricultural possibility, even the smallest climatic shift compounded quietly, year after year, until recovery was no longer mathematically possible. Greenland did not freeze to death. It simply crossed a threshold from which no sustainable return existed. Walrus ivory was the foundation of Greenland's prosperity, but it was also the quiet constraint that shaped the colony's fate. For centuries, European elites prized walrus tusks as symbols of power and devotion, carving them into religious art, ceremonial objects, and displays of status. Greenland supplied this rare material, and in return, Europe supplied what the colony could not produce for itself: the tools, grain, timber, and metal that made survival possible. This exchange created stability, but it also created dependence. When new trade routes opened and cheaper ivory from Africa and the eastern markets began flowing into Europe, demand shifted without warning. Prices fell, prestige changed hands. Greenland did not collapse because its people failed to adapt culturally or technologically. They continued to work, hunt, and trade as they always had. But the world adjusted economically in ways that no single community at the edge of the Atlantic could influence or resist. Resilience has limits. When survival depends on exchange, no amount of endurance can compensate for a market that has ceased to exist. For a long time, historians believed that the Norse in Greenland refused to learn from the Inuit, that they stubbornly clung to European customs in an environment that demanded something entirely different. It was an interpretation that felt morally satisfying and neatly explained failure as cultural arrogance. Archaeology now tells a more complicated story. Late Greenlandic remains reveal a dramatic shift in diet, with seal meat increasingly replacing livestock as the primary source of calories. Tools evolve. Hunting strategies change. Clothing becomes better suited to the Arctic. The Norse did adapt. They observed. They learned. They changed. But adaptation does not operate in isolation. These changes occurred within a system already weakened by collapsing trade networks, shrinking agricultural margins, and intensifying climatic pressure. The timing mattered more than the effort. Adaptation is not a guarantee of survival. It only works when time still exists to absorb the cost of change. When the Black Death swept through Norway in the mid-14th century, Greenland was spared the disease itself, but it was not spared the consequences. The colony was not infected. It was severed. Trade routes that had functioned for generations collapsed almost overnight. Ships stopped sailing, clergy vanished, bishops died, and were never replaced. Letters went unanswered, not because they were ignored, but because no one remained to read them. Greenland had been built as a connected society, sustained by regular contact with the wider Christian and economic world. Without warning, that world fell silent. Isolation did not bring immediate ruin. There was no single year of collapse, no recorded moment of panic. Instead, isolation worked slowly. It eroded institutions first, then knowledge, then morale. Over generations, it dissolved continuity itself, leaving a society still standing, still functioning, but increasingly cut off from the systems that had once made its survival possible. There is evidence of conflict between the Norse and Inuit groups, but it does not point to genocide, conquest, or a violent overthrow of an entire society. What archaeology reveals instead is something quieter and more difficult to interpret. Farms were abandoned rather than overrun. Buildings were left standing rather than destroyed. Households appear to have emptied gradually, not suddenly, leaving behind tools, walls, and churches that show no signs of a final catastrophic assault. This was not an apocalyptic ending written in fire and blood. It was a retreat without records, a withdrawal that unfolded slowly enough to escape the attention of history. The absence of mass graves or widespread destruction forces us to reconsider how civilizations actually end. We are conditioned to expect collapse to be dramatic, violent, and unmistakable. Greenland teaches a more unsettling lesson. A society can disappear not through spectacle, but through ordinary decisions made under narrowing constraints, until one day there is simply no one left to explain what happened. We do not know who the last Norse people in Greenland were. They were not kings, explorers, or warriors whose names demanded to be written down. They were families, farmers, and laborers whose lives unfolded far from the centers of power and record-keeping. It is unlikely that they understood themselves to be the last of anything. History is rarely experienced in real time as an ending. To them, each year would have felt like another attempt to endure one more winter, one more season, of uncertainty. They left no account of their disappearance, not because they lacked awareness, but because survival does not pause to document itself. People do not stop to write when food is scarce, when trade has vanished, and when each decision is measured against immediate necessity. They lived, they adapted, they endured, and then, without ceremony or witness, they ceased, leaving behind a silence that history can still sense, but never fully explain. History tends to survive through monuments, victories, and declarations carved into stone or ink. Yet most human lives end without record, even when their labor, endurance, and decisions shaped the world in quiet and lasting ways. The Vikings of Greenland did not vanish because they failed to understand the land or the forces acting upon them. They vanished because they understood those forces well enough to survive for as long as the world permitted it. Their story does not offer a lesson in triumph or failure. It offers something more difficult to accept. Endurance is not infinite. Adaptation is not omnipotent. Survival is always conditional, shaped by forces larger than any single community can control. If this story lingers, it may be because many families carry similar histories of migration, settlement, labor, and quiet perseverance. Lives lived at the edge of what was possible, remembered only through fragments, photographs, or stories passed down. If you hold such a memory, it deserves to be spoken, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a record that once someone endured,